Thank you all so much for having me. Welcome to you all. There's a lot to cover, so I want to start big picture to everyone. What do you see as the biggest challenge to truly moving to become a globally efficient, renewable energy-focused world? What's the biggest challenge? What's standing in our way?
Well, the biggest challenge definitely will be financing. We're not short of ideas. There's growing technology, but the challenge is financing. But I also want to raise perhaps a more complex issue, and that is what constitutes a just transition and what should be the outcome of COP28 in relation to renewable. I believe strongly that we need to have a constructive approach to this matter. And the approach of locking out any stakeholders, including petroleum producer, is not one that would lead to that constructive approach. We perhaps are in a position to speak on both sides of the coin because we are a leader on climate change and we are a leader now in energy. So there are 5 things we have to speak to on this matter. 1, what is the role of petroleum producers, the companies and the countries around the table on renewable? 2, how do we ensure that there is greater budget support for research and development? 3, how there is greater support for technology, bringing new technology into the equation. And 4th and 5th, as a newcomer to the petroleum industry, we are proposing and supporting a carbon tax and the removal of subsidies on petroleum producers. So those are the things that we are taking to COP. And I think this balanced approach is critical. If we don't pursue a balanced approach, then we're not going to constructively tackle this problem.
Rolando, what do you see as the biggest challenge to true green energy expansion?
Well, there's several challenges here. It's not only, I agree with what President Ali has just said. It's a question of money, but it's also a question of geography. And it's a question of finding the right solution that gives us continuous power. It is not only important to find renewable energy as an alternative, but it's important to find that renewable energy adapt itself to the geography of each particular country. Having wind and solar in some islands, for example, is difficult because land is very expensive, especially if it's a tourism island. Land is not necessarily available for wind. A lot of people have problems with seeing windmills near their tourism areas, as it happened to our business in the Dominican Republic, where we had to have 5 years having windmills at the port, where a minister of tourism that was not very enlightened told us that we couldn't bring the windmills into the country. So things like that have to be overcome. I think we have a lot of issues. Financing, obviously, is very important. Geography. But the transition to renewables has to have in mind that there has to be gas, for example, to be an alternative fuel while you get to renewables. Because renewables are great, but they don't work 100% of the time. And most people don't want to have their homes without electricity at night or during a storm, etc. So we have to have a very balanced approach. And if later on, if you want, I will tell you what we're doing in the Dominican Republic to try to reach 100% renewable energy coverage in an area that we dominate in the East.
Vishali?
It's a great question, and I'll break it into 2 parts. One is, what is it that we need to do to take action? What is it that businesses need to do? And, that would be things like what we saw in the G20. I'm coming from Delhi, where we had a very there was a lot of consensus around the declaration that we need to triple the targets. We need to take action on various fronts. We all need to meet our national development targets and so on and so forth. We need to work on our supply chains. We need to ensure that we get to 2030 together. We meet our net zero goals. And so, we just have to ensure that what is being phased out is faster than what needs to be phased in. And I think that's the biggest challenge in many countries, especially countries, around the world. I think we really need to be sincere. And now there's the emotion and the humanization of this journey. I think we all need to be honest about what we're trying to do. We need to be sincere about what we're trying to do. And it sounds like words, but it's super critical. We need to put faces and people behind the data and the figures we are talking about. I was recently in Tanzania and firsthand traveled to the grassroots of the country. I travel a lot in India, and while data, figures, and targets are great, but just think about what climate change is doing to people. People are losing children. Women are losing their lives. And when we talk about what we must do and what we need to get to, and before we comment on why perhaps there is diesel being used in a hospital in, say, Africa or in the remotest parts of India, that's the only option. And so we need to cooperate, we need to support the transition as well. But all in all, I think the buzzword is acceleration. We just need to accelerate empathetically.
President?
Thank you, Stephanie. Buenas tardes, amigas y amigos. So, to the capital that the President mentioned, and the right geography with the right technologies that Rolando talked about, and your people-centric, if I may phrase what you said in that way, I would add culture, societal attitude, public awareness. We still do not understand that the greatest challenge we have as humanity is being able to decouple development from carbon emissions, because so far those two have been coupled. So we need to continue development and well-being, people deserve it, but decouple carbon emissions and have them come down. I don't see persons around the world yet screaming for sustainable energies, for renewable energies. There has to be a greater awareness of where we are, the challenge we are facing, and that has to do with culture, with attitude. I understand it because we've never faced this challenge before as humankind, but we need to get everyone on board and involved.
President Ali, I know you had talked about cost being a prohibitive factor or challenge, but when you look at Guyana and your goal to be a completely renewable energy economy, what will be the greatest accelerator for you to make that happen?
Well, just to pick up from the issue of culture and sustainable development, we have to first put things into context. And I don't want to divorce Guyana from the rest of the region here, because this requires collective action. And I said the prosperity of Guyana must lead to the prosperity of the region. You have a situation where in Latin America and the Caribbean, we need $2.2 billion to achieve 4 important SDGs. You have debt to GDP ratio of 117%. In Guyana case, we're at 26.4%. You have inflation that is double digit. And you have to marry that whilst at the same time find the resources to go towards a renewable transition and moving towards net zero. Now, the issue here is that the conversation towards net zero has suddenly changed. The conversation about stopping petroleum. And that is where we have a problem. We will remove the balance from this conversation if every NGO, every actor has now shifted the goalposts from achieving net zero to stopping petroleum. You know, I just scanned the news this morning, and every news item was about death stop to petroleum, not the transition to net zero. And the conversation on transition to net zero is far different from from stopping petroleum. Secondly, we have the forest the size of England and Scotland combined, storing 19.5 gigatons of carbon, worth billions of dollars in carbon. We have one of the only country with an end user agreement sale with Hess Corporation. But guess what? That's forest that we kept alive with a deforestation rate of less than 0.036%. That forest did not bring in any wealth, although it created tremendous value for the world. So how are we going to ensure that in the transition, there is just reward for those countries who are keeping the environment, keeping the forest, and ensuring that that forest contribute to the climate equation. So I think that Guyana and where we are going to achieve the 100% renewable is not only for us. We want to create an energy hub, a regional energy hub, in which we are a net exporter of energy, most of which must come from renewable. And as Rolando just said, what is the purpose of gas in this transition? There are some who would believe that gas have no role in this transition, but yet 35 to 40%, depends on which stat you use, of the world is still having their energy source from coal. That is the first target we must eliminate. How do we eliminate all the energy that is coming from coal? So these are some of the things that we want to champion. Thank you.
Rolando, decarbonizing the electric utility in Eastern Dominican Republic was your CGI commitment last year. We saw in the video before the panel President Clinton talking about that and the success that you've had. It's a 10-year journey. Talk to us about how it's going.
Well, this idea came about in Glasgow 2 years ago at COP26. And then we brought it to FITUR, which is the tourism fair that is held every year in Madrid. It's probably the largest or one of the largest tourism fairs in the world. And since our utility in the eastern part of the Dominican Republic deals primarily with hotels and resorts, and where this utility takes care of about 75% of all Dominican tourism, which is growing and growing, we decided that the avoided cost, and I made that announcement then, and Prince Charles, then he was prince, now he's king, was at this panel where we announced this. We said we have a serious problem with the price of fuels. So what did we do? We figured that our levelized cost of energy, fuel-related and operation and maintenance, et cetera, was very high. And it got higher as the war in the Ukraine started. So we figured that if we could shut down for certain hours of the day some of our more expensive power plants and substitute that with the renewables, it would be a home run. So we hired a very impressive and qualified consulting firm to do a full analysis of what it would take to go to zero emissions or to go 100% renewable, and how long would it take. And this involves a lot of things because it's not that easy. The first 50, 60% of renewables in your system are pretty easy to achieve. The last 40 to 30% are a lot harder, and they require a bigger investment than what you originally thought of. And you have to go to batteries, you have to go to systems that work at night. For instance, we've discovered that in our concession area, there's wonderful wind at night at 200 meters of altitude or higher. We discovered that we could also build what's called pump hydro, where you take the solar energy or wind energy, and when you have excess renewables, you pump water to 200 meters of altitude or 250 meters, and at nighttime you use it as a battery. So we had to look at a lot of things. We looked at green hydrogen as a way of doing it. We found there was a lot of difficulty with hydrogen because transporting it is an issue, so you have to have the production of hydrogen near where your power plants are. And all these things are highly complicated, and they cost a lot of money. We're going to invest over $1 billion doing this. And we already started, and we already have 100 megawatts of solar has been built. We're going to build an alternative. The world cannot go 100% renewable, not at this time, maybe in 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Right now, we need to keep people working. We need to have industries be able to supply and have enough energy to supply the products they build. It is not going to be easy, but what we have to do, and I agree with President Ali, the first thing is to get rid of all the coal plants. Coal is a big contaminator in the world, and it should be replaced with natural gas and renewables and other sources of energy.
Vishali, Renew is India's leading clean energy company. Talk to us about your new commitment to CGI this year.
Great. So just to continue with the narrative of phasing out and people, that's what our commitment is about. And I'm really proud of this commitment because, what we are doing is that, you need to innovate. And what we've come out with is a round-the-clock solution, which we developed in collaboration and partnership with the government to come out with a system where we could increase the efficiencies of generation by combining wind, solar, and storage. And that has helped us increase the productivity of generation by 2.5%, so which is great and makes renewables more attractive and more efficient. We are running these projects in 3 or 4 states in India, and it's the first of its kind innovation, which merges and kind of looks at different combinations, and we are executing on the ground. It's very important for us to be able to innovate as far as the green infrastructure is concerned in the country. The infrastructure for adding renewables is significant, and the amount of load the system, the grid can take is limited. So I guess solutions like this is important. The other aspect of our commitment is on education. And before I come to that, I just wanted to just add a couple of points on the green infrastructure. So the round-the-clock project is about 400 gigawatts of round-the-clock generation, as I said, in 3 or 4 states in India. And it would entail providing energy to households and to the railway system in India as well, which is, at least in India, very coal-driven. So we'll be able to contribute to that. The other element has been education. We've seen that education is very critical. In India, people go through the sort of negative impacts of climate change, especially children and women. And if you ask them a point-blank question that, do you know what climate change is? Are you impacted by the effects of climate change? And the answer to that often is like, we don't know what it is, and no, not us. And then we give them an example of what's happening, the floods and the drought and various other issues. They're like, oh yeah, this happens here all the time, and this is what we do, and this is the number of times we've got displaced, and we've lost members of our family to floods, and so on and so forth. So therefore, the critical need is to educate, and that's what we are doing through our program. We have a curriculum, which is a green curriculum, which is being introduced in the most rural parts of our country, in the state of Rajasthan. It's a desert state, and 3, 4 other states which have limited resources, and we are just to give you an example, children walk about 3, 4 miles to get to a school in 45 degrees centigrade, which is 110 degrees Fahrenheit, or greater temperatures, to get to a classroom which doesn't have fans. And so you can imagine what is the ability to absorb anything which is being taught in those classrooms. So we do put solar panels in these classrooms, use that as a tool to educate these children around what is climate change, what is renewable energy, the science behind it, and then we use the generation to include and introduce digital education in these schools for remedial education, and also educating on the whole energy transition and what does it mean for them, really. And so hopefully getting them engaged in what is it that they can do for themselves in the future. We're going to invest about $1 billion over the next 2 years in round-the-clock and curriculum. It's a digital curriculum. It's in local vernaculars, which is critical. We believe that for people to understand the intensity of this problem, they need to be able to connect with it. They connect with their language. they connect with their cultures, and so we want to help them understand this better.
Mr. President, as long as we're talking education, I want you to give us a homework assignment. You were the person who coined the phrase, "There is no planet B." I hope you copyrighted it. I hope you own it, because we see it on T-shirts, on hats, on bumper stickers, on tote bags made of recycled material. But what do we need to collectively do if we want to actually expand into a renewable economy? What do we need to do?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, there is no planet B. The planet is going to go on. The big issue is, are we going to move ahead with the planet or not? Because the actual trajectory of carbon emissions, which are now 40 billion tons per year, is putting us on a trajectory where by the year 2050, we will have 520 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. Now, the IPCC report says we should not pass 450 parts if we don't want plus minus 2 degrees centigrade changes, and that's, of course, a completely different planet. So there's a lot of responsibility here in the room, all of us, in terms of educating, in terms of preaching, in terms of leading with an example. And we also have to find ways, Stephanie, in which we can scale, because scale is very relevant in this decade, which is critical for us to change the trajectory of carbon emissions. So when we talk about scale, I'm talking about scaling and ramping up the investment in renewables, and I'm talking about scaling and ramping up the lowering of carbon emissions. We have to achieve both at the same time. So in terms of scale, we're talking about that by the year 2030, we have to be at 4 times, we have to be building 4 times the capacity that we're building today in renewables by the year 2030. We have to ramp up electric vehicles 18 times from what we are doing today. Investment, which last year was $1.1 trillion in renewables, has to be multiplied by 3 by 2030 on a yearly basis. And we have to bring down the energy intensity by about 4% on a yearly basis from here to 2030 and there on out. On the other side, we need to scale up the reduction of carbon emissions. So, an example. At the Carbon War Room with Richard Branson, we identified sectors of the global economy where we can reduce carbon emissions in a profitable way. It has to be profitable because otherwise you don't attract the capital, entrepreneurship, and talent that we need to reduce the emissions. We identified many of these sectors, but one was shipping. There are about 55,000 ships out there on the ocean doing the world's trade. They produce about 3% of carbon emissions. Every one of them goes up on a dry dock every 5 years. If you take advantage of that moment and deploy on these ships between 4 to 8 technologies, total investment of about $3 million max, payback 18 months. What a terrific investment. You roll them off from the dry dock consuming 25% less fuel, which means 25% less carbon emissions. That's the type of scale that we need to be able to solve this critical challenge.
I know I'm running short on time, but I open this question up to all of you. There's another challenge or elephant in the room. I saw all of you talk about, and people nodding in the room, how important it is for us to move away from coal. And everyone here can agree with that, but it's easy for us to agree because the coal mining lobby is not in this room right now. But they're in Washington every single day. So help us understand, what is your approach to the hyper-politicization of renewable energy and all the roadblocks that you face in politics?
Well, it comes back to the question of the balanced approach. If we want to have a frank and constructive conversation, we have to have everyone in the room. And the president just pointed to the fact that we have technology that can cut emission by 25%. The cost to get to where we want to be in 2030 is simply prohibitive. The money is not there. So we have to get those in coal, those in petroleum, to make some commitment along the line of research and development, technology, the carbon tax, and also look at the removal of subsidy. So we need them in the room. That is what I would say for that balanced conversation.
Building a world for the future shouldn't be political, but it is. How do you get around it?
Well, the issue here, if you want me to first address the issue of coal, is that, for example, a lot of Puerto Rico, I'll give that as an example. There's a coal facility there owned by AES, and they're shutting down in 2 years. They already agreed to do that, and they're replacing it with natural gas. So it can happen. Coal is, you put a carbon tax on it, it's no longer cheap.
But even beyond coal, when you talk renewables, there is a portion of the population, there's a portion of the political set that it's a non-starter for. How do you work with that?
That has a lot to do. In Wyoming, you get you have a coal lobby because they're big in coal. West Virginia, the coal states they carry a big clout in elections and electoral colleges, and the way the system in the United States works, it's not one man, one vote. It's sort of a complicated system. So there are areas of interest or interest groups that seem to have a lot more clout than they should. Colombia, for example, is a coal country, a country that exports coal to the Caribbean, and it exports coal because it doesn't use that much coal. It's got 75% hydro. It's got gas, which supplies most of its power. But the Caribbean, some countries import Colombian coal, but they are not allowed to bring in plentiful gas from Venezuela, for example. The U.S. has sanctioned Venezuela to the detriment of a lot of the Caribbean countries. That I want to someday be able to buy gas from my friend here, because all he needs to do is put a liquefying plant. And we can do that and then get his gas and supply the Caribbean, because he's 500 miles away. But if I have to bring gas from say, the Gulf of Mexico, it's 1,400 miles away. So these are things that need to be addressed. Politics is very important in the United States, and that determines policy. And to a great degree, that policy many times is mistaken.
Vishala, your approach to the politics of renewables.
So my view would be P is for politics and P is for people, right? And so if I look at why is it that coal is, we're finding it difficult to phase it out, it's because, at least in India, politicians need votes. And a lot of the electricity is generated through the coal we have. And so it's a bit of a tricky situation. And so let me just back up a little bit. In India, we have a program which was launched by the Prime Minister. It's called the LIFE program. It's about, engaging people to get involved in this transition, to make commitments towards a sustainable lifestyle. And I think once you have the cultural shift, once you get people engaged, once you get them to own this journey, they're the ones who are going to demand that coal should be, that they're not going to have anything to do with coal. Once that happens, hopefully, we're going to get the government, who's again often looking for votes, to comply and abide. Perhaps that would help. And and I think the other way is just to, just accelerate the, renewables movement and ensure that we can overshadow and combined with the energy and the movement and the momentum of the people, hopefully we should be able to do better, not perfect, but better perhaps.
President, I give you the last words. We all know in this room, Costa Rica, you have deftly navigated the politics of renewables. Speak to that.
Yes, and I can show you my scars on the back for having done so. So there are all kinds of different barriers here in transitioning to renewables: economic, social, technical, and regulatory. But at the end of the day, it comes down to good policy that sends markets the correct signals of where we want to go and what we want to deploy our capital in. If markets receive good signals, you begin to create the public-private partnerships that are necessary to move this agenda forward. I come from a country that, as you say, Stephanie, for the last 5 years, we've had 100% of renewable electricity. That is only 35% of our energy needs. 65% are the fossil fuels for transportation that we now need to change for green hydrogen, cars, batteries, etc. But at the end of the day, it's all about that. Good policy. We instituted a carbon tax back in 1995. Very unpopular. More scars on my back. That carbon tax went into a fund, an escrow fund, that pays for environmental services. And as a result of paying farmers to grow trees and conserve them, because trees are more valuable standing than as timber, today we have increased our coverage, forest coverage, from 35% to 60% over 20 years. That's the type of policies we need to get moving ahead.
Thank you all so very much for this conversation. I sincerely appreciate it. For you in the audience, please don't move. Potentially make room for more people joining the room. Secretary of State John Kerry will be taking the stage in just a moment.
Please give a warm welcome to John Kerry.
Can you hear me? Or maybe it's premature. There is nothing like being the introductory comments coming after everything's been said, so. We're going to try and test this out. I'm going to improvise in order to not be completely repetitive and tedious in the process. But let me say what a pleasure it is to be here at CGI, which I've had the pleasure of being at previously. It's obviously had a little bit of a hiatus for all the reasons we understand. But it's wonderful to be back, and I just want to begin by saluting my friends, both the President and Hillary, for continuing to do this. CGI has made so many different kinds of contributions, not just this gathering. And the President and former Secretary of State and Senator and so much more together have really helped to define post-presidencies with a duality that most presidencies don't get. So we're all lucky, and many of you who've been so supportive for the years, I say thank you to you also for that, because it takes the empowerment to be able to do it. So let's, you've just had a very distinguished panel, and